The sun emerged reluctantly over the horizon. Its weak rays filtered through a haze of gray clouds. Inside cabin 412, the soft hum of the cruise ship's engine mingled with the groans of its occupants. Alex squinted against the faint light leaking through the curtains, his head throbbing like a relentless drumbeat. The remnants of New Year's Eve lingered in the air, a sticky sweetness of spilled champagne, mingled with the faint scent of confetti cannons and perfume. He shifted in his bunk, his arm brushing against something unfamiliar. When he looked down, he saw a gold party hat with the words 2025, a year to remember, emblazoned across it. "Guys, wake up," Alex croaked, his throat dry as sandpaper. His voice cracked, cutting through the eerie stillness. Across the room, Mia stirred, her blonde hair a tangled mess that mirrored the chaos of her mind. "What time is it?" she murmured groggily, rubbing her temples. None of them wore watches, and their phones were scattered somewhere amidst empty champagne bottles and streamers. Jason was next awake, his broad shoulders hunched as he swung his legs over the side of the bunk. He winced, touching a dark bruise on his forearm. "What the hell happened last night?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. No one had an answer. The last clear memory any of them shared was the countdown to midnight, surrounded by strangers who were just as eager to toast the new year. Beyond that, the night dissolved into fragments, flashing lights, distorted laughter, and a strange coldness that seemed out of place on a tropical cruise. As the group shuffled into the bathroom to splash cold water on their faces, an unsettling realization began to creep in. Outside the cabin door, the usual cacophony of a bustling cruise ship was conspicuously absent. No footsteps echoed in the hallway. No muffled conversations or distant announcements came through the intercom. Alex was the first to point it out. "Does it feel quiet to anyone else?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia frowned, pressing her ear to the cabin door. "It's probably just early," she said, though her tone betrayed her unease. Still, they agreed to investigate. Stepping into the corridor, they were met with an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow their footsteps. The hallways were spotless, as though meticulously cleaned overnight, but there was no sign of the housekeeping staff. "Maybe everyone's nursing hangovers," Jason joked weakly, but his forced grin didn't reach his eyes. The group made their way to the ship's main deck, their anxiety growing with every empty lounge and deserted dining area they passed. The ship, which had been teeming with life the night before, now felt like a hollow shell. The decorations from the New Year's Eve party were still up. Glittering streamers hung limply from the ceiling, and balloons floated listlessly into corners. Yet, there was no one to be found. When they reached the grand ballroom, the sight that greeted them stopped them in their tracks. Tables were still set for a banquet, complete with half-empty glasses and plates of untouched hors d'oeuvres. Party hats and noisemakers were scattered haphazardly across the floor, but not a single person was in sight. "This is getting weird," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex's chest tightened as he approached the stage, where the band's instruments were still set up, as if they had been abandoned mid-song. A microphone lay on the floor, its cord coiled like a snake. Jason picked up a champagne flute from a nearby table and inspected it. "It's warm," he said, frowning, "like it's been sitting out for hours." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Something was wrong, and they all felt it in their gut. "Maybe there's an announcement or something," Alex suggested, trying to steady his voice. "Let's check the lobby." But when they reached the main atrium, they found only more emptiness. The massive chandelier overhead glittered like a frozen constellation, casting fractured light onto the marble floor below. It wasn't until Mia checked the reception desk that their situation became even stranger. Every computer monitor was off, and the clock on the wall was frozen at 12:01 a.m. "This doesn't make any sense," she said, her voice trembling. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. As the minutes stretched into an uneasy silence, the realization sank in. They were alone on a ship that, just hours ago, had been filled with life and laughter. The celebration had ended, but something else had taken its place, a quiet, suffocating dread that none of them could shake. The group stood frozen in the cavernous atrium, their breath shallow, as if any sound might awaken something unseen. Alex paced in tight circles, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished marble floor. "Okay, let's not panic," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his words. "Maybe the crew is having some kind of meeting, or there's an emergency drill we missed." "An emergency drill where they abandoned the passengers?" Mia shot back, crossing her arms. Her sharp tone was an anchor against the rising tide of unease. Jason leaned over the reception desk, tapping the blank computer screens with his knuckle, as if coaxing them to life. "Power's out here," he muttered, "but the lights are still on everywhere else." "That's odd. Odd," Mia echoed, her voice rising. "This whole situation is insane. People don't just disappear." The group decided to split up and search the ship systematically, though none of them relished the idea of wandering the empty corridors alone. Alex and Mia headed toward the lower decks, where the crew quarters and maintenance areas were located. Jason made his way to the upper deck to check the pool and observation lounge. They agreed to meet back at the atrium in 30 minutes. As Alex and Mia descended the spiral staircase, the air seemed to grow colder. The grand, open design of the ship gave way to narrower, more utilitarian hallways. The vibrant decorations and polished wood paneling above deck were replaced by plain white walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. It felt as though they had crossed an invisible threshold, leaving behind the luxury of the cruise ship and entering its hidden, skeletal framework. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered, stopping abruptly. Alex strained to listen, but the only sound was the faint hum of the ship's engine, a low vibration that thrummed through the metal walls. "No," he replied, though the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Mia hesitated before continuing. "It's like, I don't know. It feels like we're being watched." They reached the crew quarters, finding door after door locked. Alex pounded on one of them, shouting, "Hello? Is anyone there? We need help." His voice echoed down the corridor, but no answer came. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, stepping back. Meanwhile, Jason roamed the sun deck, his gaze sweeping across rows of empty lounge chairs. The pool's surface shimmered in the sunlight, pristine and undisturbed, as though no one had swum in it for days. He leaned over the railing and peered at the endless expanse of ocean. It was unsettlingly calm, with no other ships in sight, no birds circling above, and not even a trace of land on the horizon. Something caught his eye, a glint of silver floating in the water far below. Squinting, he realized it was a cluster of party hats and confetti bobbing on the waves. "What the hell?" he muttered, gripping the railing tighter. The debris didn't make sense. Why was it out there when the party had been held inside? Back below deck, Alex and Mia discovered an unlocked storage room. Inside, they found shelves lined with cleaning supplies and tools, but no sign of life. Mia picked up a clipboard hanging from the wall. It listed maintenance tasks for December 2024, with several notes scrawled in a hurried hand. The last entry caught her attention. December 31st, engine inspection complete. Midnight fireworks prep confirmed. Remember, no passengers below deck C after 11 p.m. "What does that mean?" she asked, showing the clipboard to Alex. His brow furrowed as he read it. "No passengers? That's weirdly specific. And why would they care after 11 p.m.? Their search yielded no further answers, so they returned to the atrium, finding Jason already waiting for them. He looked pale, his usual bravado replaced by a haunted expression. "There's no one up there," he said flatly. "Not even staff. And I found stuff floating in the water." "Stuff?" Alex asked, his stomach nodding. "Party hats. Streamers. Like someone threw the whole damn celebration overboard," Jason replied, rubbing the back of his neck. As they regrouped, an unsettling realization crystallized. They were truly alone on the ship, with no sign of passengers, crew, or any logical explanation for their predicament. The festive remnants of New Year's Eve now felt like a cruel mockery, the echoes of a celebration that had somehow gone horribly wrong. The silence pressed down on them like a physical weight. For the first time, none of them had anything to say. And in that silence, each of them wondered the same thing. If they couldn't find anyone else on board, what might eventually find them? The eerie calm of the empty ship weighed on the trio as they huddled in the atrium. Jason paced in agitated strides, his shoes squeaking faintly against the marble. Mia sat stiffly on the edge of a leather armchair, clutching the clipboard they had found as though it might yield answers if she stared hard enough. Alex leaned against a pillar, his face pale and drawn. "We need a plan," Alex said finally, breaking the oppressive silence. "We've covered a lot of ground, and there's no sign of anyone. Maybe we should check the bridge. Someone's got to be there. Someone's steering this thing, at least." Jason snorted. "Yeah, sure, let's just waltz up there and find the captain sipping coffee. If this isn't some elaborate prank or a nightmare, it's something worse. Then what do you suggest?" Mia snapped, her voice sharp with tension. "Sitting here until we starve? I don't want to wait around to find out what's going on. We need to keep moving." Reluctantly, Jason agreed, and they began their trek toward the bridge. As they ascended the long staircases leading to the ship's command center, the grand design of the cruise ship seemed to mock them. Its opulence now felt grotesque, a stage set for some unseen menace. The trio moved quickly, their footsteps echoing ominously in the cavernous spaces. When they reached the bridge, the reinforced glass doors were slightly ajar. Alex hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. "Should we knock?" He joked weakly, but no one laughed. He pushed the door open slowly, and they stepped into the room. The bridge was a technological marvel, filled with glowing monitors, sleek consoles, and a massive control panel at the center. The panoramic windows provided a breathtaking view of the ocean stretching endlessly in all directions. Yet, despite the impressive machinery, the bridge was as lifeless as the rest of the ship. Mia approached one of the monitors, her fingers trembling as she pressed buttons at random. The screens flickered but displayed nothing useful. No radar, no navigation data, just static. Jason studied the control panel, scanning for anything that might give them a clue. "It's like it's running, but not actually doing anything," he said, frustrated. Suddenly, Mia gasped. "Look!" She pointed to a monitor in the corner that had just sprung to life. A live feed of the ballroom appeared on the screen, the camera panning slowly across the empty space. At first, it was just as they had left it, deserted tables, abandoned decorations. But then the camera paused, focusing on a corner of the room. "Is that?" Alex squinted at the screen. In the corner, a shadow moved, subtle, almost imperceptible. It didn't belong to anything visible in the frame. The trio leaned closer, their faces illuminated by the bluish glow of the monitor. The shadow shifted, as if aware it was being watched. Then, without warning, the screen went black. "What the hell was that?" Jason demanded, backing away from the console, as if it might spring to life and attack. "Someone or something is down there," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Alex's mind raced. The shadow on the monitor wasn't just eerie, it was impossible. There was no object in the room that could cast such a shape, and its movement felt deliberate, almost sentient. "We need to go back to the ballroom," he said, though his stomach churned at the thought. "Are you crazy?" Jason barked. "We should lock ourselves in here and wait. Whatever that thing is, I'm not walking into its territory." But Mia shook her head, her jaw tightening with determination. "We need answers, and hiding won't get them. Whatever it is, we're already on its turf. If we're going to survive this, we need to understand what's happening." After a tense argument, they agreed to return to the ballroom. The walk back was silent, their nerves stretched taut. Every creak of the ship and distant hum of machinery felt amplified, as though the ship itself was alive and watching them. When they arrived at the ballroom, the space was exactly as they had left it, silent, still, and seemingly empty. But now, the air felt heavier, charged with an unseen energy. Alex scanned the room, his heart pounding in his chest. "Whatever was on that screen, it's gone now," he said, though his voice carried no relief. The group stood in uneasy silence, their senses straining to pick up any sign of movement. Suddenly, the sound of soft laughter echoed faintly through the room. It was high-pitched and distant, like the giggle of a child, yet it seemed to come from all directions at once. Tell me you heard that, Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. They all had, and though the ballroom was empty, they felt the undeniable presence of something unseen, something that was no longer content to hide. The laughter hung in the air, dissonant and mocking, its source as elusive as a fading dream. Alex, Mia, and Jason exchanged wide-eyed glances, their breaths shallow and synchronized in their dread. The vast ballroom, once a stage for joy and celebration, now felt like a predator's lair, waiting to pounce. Where did it come from? Mia whispered, clutching the edge of a nearby table for support. Her knuckles were white, her grip as rigid as her expression. It didn't come from anywhere, Jason replied, his voice trembling. It was everywhere, like the damn walls were laughing at us. Alex stepped forward cautiously, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. The laughter had ceased, leaving only a vacuum of silence that seemed to amplify every sound they made. He stopped in the middle of the room, turning in slow circles, scanning every corner for movement. Maybe there's a speaker system or something. A prank, he offered weakly, though he didn't believe his own words. Mia shook her head. No one's here to pull a prank, Alex. And even if they were, how do you explain whatever we saw on that screen? Jason stayed near the entrance, his back pressed against the ornate double doors. He scanned the room nervously, gripping a brass candlestick he had grabbed from a nearby table. Whatever it is, I'm not sticking around to find out. We need to get off this ship. Alex turned to face him. And how do you suggest we do that? Genius? The lifeboats are probably useless, and we don't even know where we are. Mia suddenly stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the far corner of the room. Wait, do you see that? Alex followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. The corner where the shadow had lingered on the monitor now appeared darker than it should have been, as though the light from the chandelier above refused to reach it. The darkness seemed to shift slightly, an almost imperceptible ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a breath of wind. Jason saw it too and swore under his breath. No, I'm done. We're leaving right now. He turned to pull open the double doors, but they wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, his movements becoming frantic. It's locked. From the outside, he said, his voice rising. The room felt smaller now, the oppressive silence closing in on them like a tightening noose. Alex took a step back, his mind racing for a solution. He tried to keep his voice steady as he said, "Okay, we stay calm. We'll find another way out." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the chandelier's glow returned, the corner was empty, normal. The shadow was gone, but the relief was short-lived. From the middle of the room came a faint, rhythmic sound, a slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap. The group froze, their eyes snapping toward the source. A champagne glass on a nearby table was rocking gently, as though an invisible hand had just set it down. Did that just? Mia trailed off, her voice barely audible. Alex approached the table cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out to steady the glass, but before his fingers could touch it, the tapping sound erupted again, this time louder, coming from every table in the room. Glasses rattled, plates shifted, and chairs scraped against the floor as if an unseen force was playing with them. "Run!" Jason shouted, abandoning the locked doors and sprinting toward the back exit of the ballroom. Mia and Alex followed, their footsteps echoing chaotically as the cacophony grew louder behind them. They burst into the corridor, slamming the door shut behind them. The sound ceased instantly, leaving only their ragged breaths and the distant hum of the ship's engines. "Okay," Jason gasped, leaning against the wall. "What the hell was that?" Alex doubled over, his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think whatever it is, it's playing with us." Mia looked back at the ballroom door, her expression hardened by a mixture of fear and determination. "It's not just playing," she said quietly. "It's trying to scare us. And it's working." The group exchanged a grim look, the weight of their predicament pressing down on them. They couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't a prank or a dream. or a solvable mystery. Something unnatural was happening on the ship, and it was only just beginning. The corridor stretched out before them, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow that felt wrong against the suffocating tension in the air. Alex, Mia, and Jason moved in a tight cluster, their every step deliberate, as though the ship itself might react to their presence. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the faint creaks of the ship and the distant hum of machinery. Jason clutched the brass candlestick he had taken from the ballroom like a lifeline. His knuckles were pale, and his face was set in grim determination. "We need to find a map or something," he muttered, breaking the oppressive quiet. "If we can figure out how to get to the lifeboats, maybe—" Mia cut him off with a sharp whisper. "Stop!" The trio froze in place. Alex's eyes darted around, searching for what had made her react. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Mia didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward a door just a few feet ahead, partially ajar. A dim, flickering light spilled out from the room beyond, casting distorted shadows on the corridor walls. "That light wasn't on before," she said. "Are you sure?" Jason asked, though the quaver in his voice betrayed his skepticism. "I'm sure," Mia replied firmly. Alex took a cautious step forward, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to run. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. "Stay behind me," he said, though his trembling hands betrayed his bravery. He pushed the door open slowly, and the three of them peered inside. The room was a small office, its walls lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. A desk sat at the center, its surface cluttered with papers and an old-fashioned lamp that flickered erratically. The light cast eerie, jagged shadows across the room, making it difficult to distinguish objects from their warped reflections. On the desk was a single notebook, its cover tattered and stained. Alex stepped forward cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the carpeted floor. He reached for the notebook, his fingers brushing against its cracked surface. "Wait," Mia hissed. "What if it's, I don't know, a trap?" "It's just a notebook," Alex replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. He flipped it open to the first page, and the trio leaned in to read. The handwriting was erratic, as though written in haste or under duress. The first entry read, "If you're reading this, you're already in danger. The ship isn't empty. It's never empty. They're here, watching, waiting. Don't trust the lights. Don't trust the shadows. And above all, don't follow the whispers." Mia recoiled, her eyes wide with alarm. "Who wrote this? And who's they?" Before Alex could respond, the lamp on the desk flickered violently, then went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. A low, guttural hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and the floor beneath their feet. "Get out," Jason hissed, his voice barely audible over the rising hum. As they turned to leave, a faint whisper reached their ears, chilling and melodic. It wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from the corridor outside. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably beckoning, inviting. Jason froze. "Do you hear that?" he asked, though the question was rhetorical. "We're not following it," Mia said firmly, grabbing Jason's arm and pulling him toward the door. But Alex hesitated. The whisper wasn't just a sound, it was pulling at him, a magnetic force tugging at the edges of his mind. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to be settling over him. It's in my head," he whispered. "Don't listen," Mia shouted, her voice breaking the spell. She grabbed Alex's wrist and yanked him toward the corridor, slamming the door shut behind them. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only their ragged breaths and the oppressive silence of the ship. "What the hell was that?" Jason demanded, his voice cracking. "I don't know," Mia replied, her hands trembling. "But whatever it was, it knows we're here." Alex stared at the closed door, his heart racing. The notebook's warning echoed in his mind. Don't trust the lights. Don't trust the shadows. And above all, don't follow the whispers. As the three of them stood in the dimly lit corridor, the ship seemed to groan around them, the sound resonating like a deep exhalation. The message in the notebook was clear. They weren't alone, and whoever, or whatever, was on the ship with them was far from welcoming. The corridor ahead seemed endless, a labyrinth of gleaming metal walls and dim, flickering lights that cast distorted shadows on every surface. Alex, Mia, and Jason moved in tense silence, their nerves frayed and senses heightened after the encounter in the office. The ship's atmosphere was stifling, as though the very air had grown heavier, pressing down on their chests with invisible hands. Mia broke the silence first, her voice hushed but urgent. "We need a plan. Wandering aimlessly isn't going to help us. This place, it's messing with us." Alex nodded, still gripping the notebook they had taken from the office. He hadn't dared open it again, fearing what other cryptic warnings might lie within. "Agreed. If we can find a bridge, maybe we can figure out what's really going on. There has to be a log or something." Jason frowned, his eyes darting nervously around them. "And what if we find out it's worse than we thought? What if there's no one left alive on this ship?" Mia shot him a glare. "We already know it's bad, but sitting here debating isn't going to fix anything." They pressed on, turning corners and descending staircases that seemed to lead them deeper into the ship's bowels. The further they went, the more the corridors began to change. What started as clean, modern hallways gave way to rusted metal panels and exposed pipes that hissed and groaned as though alive. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of seawater hung in the air, sharp and briny. Jason stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Wait, do you hear that?" Alex and Mia froze, their ears straining. At first, there was only silence, but then it came, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. "Not this again," Mia muttered, her hands clenching into fists. "It's just trying to scare us." "Ignore it." Jason shook his head. "No, this is different. It's leading us somewhere." "Are you serious?" Alex asked, incredulous. "You want to follow the creepy noise?" Jason's face was pale, but his expression was resolute. "Look around, Alex. Do you have a better idea?" Because wandering in circles isn't working. Reluctantly, they moved toward the sound, their footsteps hesitant and uneven. The tapping grew louder as they descended another staircase, this one steep and narrow, the metal steps slick with condensation. At the bottom, they found themselves in a cavernous space filled with towering machinery. The room was dimly lit by scattered bulbs that buzzed and flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, her voice echoing faintly. Alex scanned the room, his eyes catching on a massive control panel set against one wall. It was covered in knobs, switches, and dials, many of which were labeled in faded, indecipherable text. But what drew his attention most was the glowing green monitor at its center, displaying a series of pulsing dots on a grid. "It's some kind of engine room," Alex said, moving cautiously toward the panel. Mia followed, but Jason lingered near the staircase, his eyes fixed on a darkened corner of the room. "Hey guys," he began, his voice tight with unease. Alex turned just in time to see a figure dart across the shadows, too quick and indistinct to make out any details. "Did you see that?" Jason nodded, gripping the candlestick tighter. "I'm not imagining this. There's someone." Before he could finish, the machinery in the room roared to life, the cacophony deafening and sudden. Steam hissed from pipes, and the floor vibrated beneath their feet. The green monitor on the control panel blinked furiously, the dots on the grid scattering in chaotic patterns. "Turn it off!" Mia shouted over the noise. Alex scrambled to the panel, flipping switches and twisting knobs at random, but nothing happened. The noise grew louder, the vibrations more intense. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the commotion ceased, plunging the room into an eerie silence once more. But something had changed. The air felt different, heavier, colder. And then they saw it, a trail of wet footprints leading from the far end of the room, stopping just a few feet from where Jason stood. Mia gasped, pulling Jason back as the shadows seemed to ripple and shift. A voice, low and guttural, echoed through the room, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. Alex backed away from the control panel, his heart pounding. "We need to get out of here. Now!" The three of them bolted up the staircase, not daring to look back. The tapping sound resumed, louder and faster this time, chasing them as they fled. By the time they reached the top, the noise had stopped, but the sense of dread lingered, wrapping around them like a shroud. They huddled in the corridor, gasping for breath. None of them spoke, but the same thought was etched on all their faces. Whatever was on this ship, it wasn't just trying to scare them, it was hunting them. The three friends leaned against the cold metal walls of the corridor, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The distant hum of the ship's engines felt almost soothing compared to the chaos they had just escaped. For a moment, none of them dared speak, the memory of the wet footprints and guttural voice still vivid in their minds. Jason finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. "What was that? It wasn't human, was it?" Mia shook her head, her expression grim. "No, it wasn't. But it doesn't matter what it was. We can't stay here. We have to keep moving." Alex clutched the notebook tighter, its weight feeling more ominous with every passing moment. He flipped it open again, scanning the pages for anything that might explain what they had just encountered. Amid the scrawled warnings, a single phrase stood out. "The gallery hides the truth." He held the notebook up, showing it to Mia and Jason. "What does this mean? A gallery? Could it be a part of the ship?" Jason furrowed his brow. "Maybe like an art gallery? Some cruise ships have them, right?" Mia nodded. "It's worth checking out. If it's a place that hides the truth, maybe it has answers." They set off again, navigating the labyrinthine corridors with a renewed sense of purpose. The ship seemed to shift around them, the layout growing more disjointed and confusing. Hallways looped back on themselves, and doors that should have led to other areas opened into empty voids or dead ends. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon a set of double doors with a faded plaque above them reading the Voyager Gallery. The doors creaked as Alex pushed them open, revealing a long, dimly lit room filled with rows of paintings, sculptures, and other artifacts. The air inside was heavy, as if saturated with memories and whispers of the past. The gallery was eerily quiet, save for the soft creak of the floor beneath their feet. The walls were lined with paintings, each one depicting scenes of the ocean in various states of tranquility and chaos. But as they moved deeper into the room, the artwork grew darker and more unsettling. One painting showed a ship being consumed by a whirlpool, ghostly faces screaming from the waves. Another depicted shadowy figures emerging from the water, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Mia stopped in front of a sculpture, a twisted, rusted piece of metal resembling a shipwreck. She reached out to touch it, but Alex grabbed her wrist. "Don't! We don't know what these things can do." Jason wandered toward a painting at the far end of the gallery, his gaze transfixed. "Guys," he called out, his voice distant. "You need to see this." They joined him, their eyes falling on a massive canvas that dominated the wall. It showed a scene eerily similar to their current predicament. A group of people trapped aboard a ship, their faces contorted in fear as shadowy figures loomed over them. At the center of the painting was a figure that looked disturbingly like Alex, clutching a notebook identical to the one he held. "Is that us?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Before Alex could answer, the lights in the gallery flickered, and a low, rumbling sound filled the room. The paintings on the walls seemed to ripple, as if the figures within them were alive and moving. The ocean scenes grew more turbulent, waves crashing violently and shadowy forms writhing beneath the surface. Jason backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But as they turned toward the exit, the double doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. The room plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the eerie glow of the paintings. The rumbling grew louder, and the shadowy figures began to emerge from the artwork, their forms shifting and fluid as though made of smoke and water. Mia screamed, grabbing a heavy sculpture and hurling it at one of the figures. It passed straight through, the shadow barely flinching as it advanced toward them. Alex flipped open the notebook, desperate for guidance. But the pages were blank, the scrawled warnings vanished. "Alex, do something!" Jason shouted, swinging his candlestick wildly at the shadows. "I'm trying," Alex yelled back, his mind racing. He remembered the phrase from earlier, "The gallery hides the truth." It had to mean something. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a painting near the back wall. It was the only one that remained untouched by the chaos. A serene depiction of calm waters beneath a starry sky. Something about it seemed inviting, like a beacon in the storm. "That painting!" Alex shouted, pointing. "Get to it!" They bolted toward the canvas, dodging and weaving as the shadows lunged at them. Jason reached it first, slamming his fist against the frame in frustration. "What now? Help me pull it down!" Alex yelled, grabbing one edge of the painting. Together, they yanked the canvas from the wall, revealing a hidden passage behind it. Without hesitation, they clambered through, the shadows howling in rage as the opening sealed shut behind them. They collapsed in a narrow tunnel, gasping for breath. The rumbling had ceased, and the oppressive weight of the gallery was gone. But the questions remained, gnawing at their minds like a relentless tide. What was the gallery hiding? And what awaited them at the end of this new path? The hidden passage was cramped, its walls rough and damp as though carved in haste. The faint smell of salt lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of rust. Alex, Mia, and Jason huddled together, their breaths echoing softly in the confined space. The adrenaline that had driven them through the gallery was beginning to wane, replaced by a creeping dread that hung heavy in the silence. Jason broke the quiet, his voice trembling. "Where does this even lead? It feels like we're going deeper into the ship, or maybe out of it." Mia ran her fingers along the uneven walls, her eyes narrowing. "This can't be part of the ship's design. It's too rough. It feels ancient, like it doesn't belong here." Alex, clutching the notebook, flipped through its pages once more. His frustration mounted as he found only blank sheets. Whatever guidance the mysterious book had offered earlier seemed to have vanished. Yet, the memory of the phrase, "The gallery hides the truth," lingered in his mind. Perhaps this passage was part of that hidden truth, but what kind of truth came with such horrors? They moved forward cautiously, their footsteps muffled against the damp floor. The passage began to widen, its walls giving way to a larger chamber. A faint light emanated from an unknown source, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, its surface engraved with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer as they looked at them. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason approached the pedestal, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. He traced the edge of the engravings with his finger, shivering as the surface felt unnaturally cold. These symbols, they look like they're alive. Alex's gaze fell to the floor surrounding the pedestal. More symbols were etched into the ground, forming a large circular pattern. At each cardinal point of the circle was a distinct marking: a crescent moon, a rising sun, a storm cloud, and an anchor. "These might be clues," Alex muttered, stepping closer. "It's like some kind of ritual site." Mia frowned, her unease deepening. Ritual? On a cruise ship? What kind of twisted things were these people involved in? Jason took a step back, his expression darkening. "You think this explains what's been happening? The shadows, the whatever the hell was in the gallery. What if this is the cause?" Before Alex could answer, a low rumble reverberated through the chamber, similar to the sound they had heard in the gallery. The engravings on the pedestal began to glow faintly, the shifting symbols pulsing in rhythm with the sound. The light in the room dimmed, casting their faces into shadow. "We need to go," Mia said urgently, backing away. "Now!" But as she turned toward the passage they had come through, it was gone. The wall was seamless, with no indication that an opening had ever existed. Panic set in, her breath quickening as she frantically searched for another way out. Jason grabbed her shoulder. "Calm down. We'll find a way. There has to be." His words were cut off by a sudden, piercing shriek. It wasn't human. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, layered with an otherworldly howl. The glowing symbols on the pedestal intensified, and from the shadows, figures began to emerge. They weren't like the shadowy forms from the gallery. These figures had more substance, their bodies appearing to be made of rusted metal and cracked porcelain. Their faces were blank, save for hollow eyes that radiated a sickly green light. Alex instinctively held the notebook in front of him, as if it could shield them from the advancing horrors. "What do we do?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figures moved closer, their limbs creaking and grinding with each step. The air grew colder, the chill biting at their skin. Jason grabbed a loose piece of metal from the floor, brandishing it like a weapon. "We fight if we have to." "No!" Alex shouted, his eyes darting to the pedestal. The symbols, they're reacting to something. Maybe we can use them. Mia, her instincts sharp despite her fear, ran to the pedestal and examined the symbols on the floor. "The anchor," she said, pointing. "It's glowing brighter than the others. Maybe it's a starting point?" With no other options, Alex and Jason joined her. Together, they pressed their hands to the glowing anchor symbol. The moment they did, the chamber shook violently, and the figures let out an ear-splitting wail. The symbols on the pedestal flared with blinding light, and a sudden force knocked the three of them backward. When the light faded, the figures were gone. The chamber was silent again, save for their labored breathing. But the passage was still sealed, and the pedestal now displayed a single, haunting message. "This is only the beginning." Mia stared at the words, her voice barely a whisper. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Alex clenched the notebook, his resolve hardening. "Whatever it is, we're not backing down. We need to find out what this place is, and why it won't let us go." The oppressive silence following the disappearance of the figures was as unnerving as their sudden appearance. Alex, Mia, and Jason sat on the cold, damp floor of the chamber, their breaths shallow and minds racing. The pedestal's cryptic warning, "This is only the beginning," loomed over them like an unspoken curse. Jason was the first to break the silence, his voice edged with frustration. "What beginning? Beginning of what? This isn't some sick game." He slammed his fist against the floor, the sound reverberating eerily through the chamber. Alex examined the notebook again, his fingers trembling. The blank pages were slowly filling with faint text, but the writing was fragmented and incoherent. Words like truth, sacrifice, and return seemed to bleed through the paper, as if written in some invisible ink activated by the pedestal's light. Mia paced the room, her anxiety mounting. "This isn't random. That pedestal, it reacted to us. Whatever this is, it knows we're here. It's like it's testing us." Alex nodded reluctantly, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of information. The symbols, the crescent moon, the storm cloud, and the sun, they're not just decorations. They're part of whatever this ritual is. The anchor was only the first step, but a step toward what? Jason interjected, his eyes darting toward the sealed passage. "We're trapped here with no clue what we're even dealing with." As if in response to his words, the chamber grew colder. The faint light from the pedestal dimmed, casting the room into an almost complete darkness. Then, a soft sound began to echo, barely audible at first but growing louder. It was a whisper, indistinct yet chilling, like the murmurs of a crowd just beyond a veil. Mia froze mid-step, her head snapping toward the source of the sound. "Do you hear that?" Alex and Jason nodded, their faces pale. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, swirling around them like an invisible tide. The words were unintelligible, but the tone carried an undeniable weight: anger, despair, and something far darker. Suddenly, the pedestal flared to life again, and the light coalesced into a new image above its surface. It was a crude map, etched with lines and symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. At its center was a shape that resembled the cruise ship, surrounded by concentric circles and marked with the same four symbols from the floor. Alex studied the map intently, his heart pounding. "It's showing us something. Look, the anchor is glowing here, but the crescent moon, it's highlighted now too. Maybe that's the next step." Jason squinted at the image, his skepticism evident. "So, we're supposed to just find this crescent moon symbol and hope it doesn't get us killed? Great plan." Mia crossed her arms, her voice firm despite her fear. "Do you have a better idea? Because sitting here waiting for those things to come back isn't exactly a winning strategy." The group's reluctant consensus was cut short by another shift in the room's atmosphere. The whispers grew louder, and the walls began to pulse with a faint, sickly green light. The passageway that had sealed earlier suddenly reappeared, but it was no longer the dark, narrow tunnel they had entered. Instead, it was bathed in an eerie glow, and the faint outline of the crescent moon symbol was visible at its far end. Jason grabbed his makeshift weapon, his jaw tightening. "Looks like we got our next stop. Let's hope this doesn't get us all killed." Mia and Alex exchanged a glance. Their determination mingled with dread. They stepped cautiously toward the glowing passage, the whispers now a cacophony of indistinct voices urging them forward. As they moved deeper into the new corridor, the walls seemed to shift and ripple, as though alive. Shadows danced just beyond the edges of their vision, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind them, though no one was there. Finally, they reached the end of the passage, where the crescent moon symbol was carved into the wall. Beneath it was a small indentation, just large enough to fit a hand. Mia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stop. Whatever's on the other side of this, it's not going to be good. Alex stepped forward, his resolve solidifying. "We don't have a choice. This thing, whatever it is, it's leading us for a reason." With a deep breath, he placed his hand into the indentation. The wall trembled, and a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. As the wall slid open to reveal another chamber, the whispers ceased, leaving only an ominous silence. The group stepped inside, their fear mounting as they took in the sight before them. The new room was larger, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to pulse like veins. At its center was a massive, blackened tree, its twisted branches stretching toward the ceiling. And hanging from those branches were shapes, faintly human, yet grotesquely distorted, swaying gently as though caught in an invisible breeze. Mia's voice cracked as she whispered, "What the hell is this place?" None of them had an answer. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the faint sound of a heartbeat filled the air. The crescent moon symbol at their feet began to glow, and the chilling realization dawned on them. The ritual wasn't just guiding them. It was feeding on them. The weight of the chamber pressed down on Alex, Mia, and Jason like a physical force. The air seemed thicker here, almost suffocating. They stood at the threshold of the room, their eyes locked on the twisted, blackened tree at its center. The sight of the grotesque, dangling shapes was a nightmare made real, bodies suspended from the branches like forgotten trophies. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but the sickly, pale outlines were unmistakable. These were no mere decorations. They were once human. Mia was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave. Now." Her voice was trembling, barely above a whisper, but it carried an urgency that both Alex and Jason could feel. They wanted to argue, to find a way out, but every part of them knew they were already too far in. Alex stepped forward, his body moving of its own accord, as if drawn by an invisible force. "We can't leave. Not yet." His voice was hoarse, his mind reeling from the sight of the twisted tree and the figures hanging from it. He felt a compulsion, a pull deep within his chest, urging him to approach the dark heart of the room. Jason followed behind, his footsteps hesitant but determined. "We're not walking away from this. We came this far, we have to see it through." Mia's eyes darted from one figure to the next, her breath catching in her throat. They're watching us," she muttered, her hands shaking. The dangling bodies, though lifeless, seemed to sway ever so slightly, as if alive, as though aware of their presence. She looked away quickly, not wanting to believe it, but unable to shake the feeling of being observed. The silence in the room was unbearable. The beating of their hearts was all they could hear. Each of them was caught between a sense of deep terror and an overwhelming sense of curiosity, the need to understand what was happening slowly, outweighing their fear. They couldn't explain why. There was something about this place that felt like it was never meant to be disturbed, something that had been left in stasis for a reason. But now, it seemed as though they had awakened it. As they approached the tree, the pulsating symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. A deep hum filled the air, vibrating through their bones. Alex reached out, his hand hovering just inches from one of the branches. The moment his fingers brushed against the dark wood, a searing pain shot through his body. He jerked back, his chest heaving with pain, but the sensation faded just as quickly as it came. "What the hell was that?" Jason asked, his voice laced with both fear and confusion. Alex swallowed hard, the aftertaste of the sensation still fresh in his mouth. I don't know. It was like it wanted something from me." Mia stepped closer, a look of determination settling on her face. "Whatever this is, it's not just some relic. It's alive, and it wants us to make a choice." Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the room. "Look at the symbols on the walls. They're moving." Indeed, the intricate designs etched into the walls were no longer static. They shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a slow-motion tide creeping across the surface. The symbols weren't just random patterns. They were telling a story Alex couldn't quite understand, but one that felt eerily familiar. "The book," Alex muttered, his mind scrambling for answers. "The notebook. It's been leading us here." He pulled it from his bag and flipped through the pages once more. The pages, which had been blank earlier, were now filled with an unsettlingly clear script, an ancient language that seemed to writhe beneath his fingers. Mia leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "What does it say?" Alex stared at the text, his eyes straining to make sense of the words. It's a warning. The tree, the heart of the void, was not meant to be disturbed. The people who worshipped here, they didn't just offer sacrifices. They became the tree." Jason recoiled in horror. "Wait, you're saying that those people, those bodies hanging up there, are the remains of the people who came before us?" Alex nodded, his face pale. "I think so. They weren't just sacrifices. They were taken by the tree. And now, the tree is calling us?" Mia's breath caught in her throat. "Calling us? What do you mean?" Alex looked at the tree, his expression unreadable. "It needs something, or someone. It needs a new offering." As the last words left his mouth, the room seemed to darken, the symbols on the walls becoming more pronounced. The heartbeats, their heartbeats, began to sync with the rhythm of the pulsing light. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. A deep rumbling echoed from the walls, and the figures hanging from the branches of the tree swayed once more, their faces now illuminated by an unnatural light. For the first time, Alex could see their faces clearly. They were contorted in pain, their eyes wide open, empty. But beneath that emptiness, there was something else, something desperate. It was as though they were begging for release, for the nightmare to end. Mia turned away, her hands over her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could retreat, a voice filled the chamber. It was soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder, reverberating through the walls. "You cannot leave," it said. "You have come too far. The heart of the void has claimed you. There is no turning back." The voice echoed again, now coming from every direction. "The tree has chosen. The offering is you." And with that, the room plunged into darkness. The darkness that swallowed the room was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was as if the very concept of light had been erased from this place. Alex, Mia, and Jason stood frozen in place, the oppressive silence suffocating, as the words from the voice still reverberated through their minds. "The offering is you." The weight of those words felt like chains around their chests, constricting with every breath they took. They could no longer hear their own heartbeats over the ringing in their ears. Mia was the first to speak, her voice trembling with disbelief and fear. "What does it mean? How can we be the offering?" The words barely left her lips before she seemed to regret asking them. They all knew the answer, deep down. The tree, the twisted figures, the rituals. They were all part of some horrific, ancient pact, and they had stumbled too far into its web to escape. Jason gripped her arm tightly, his knuckles white. "We need to find a way out. This isn't real. It's not real." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his stomach, the gnawing terror that there was something undeniably real about all of this. Alex felt a strange compulsion to move forward. His body seemed to betray him, drawing him toward the center of the room where the tree stood. It was as if it was calling to him, like a magnetic force pulling him in. "We can't leave," he said, his voice hollow, almost robotic. "We're here because we have to be. We have to face it." Mia turned to him, panic in her eyes. "Alex, don't!" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the haze of fear, but it barely reached him. There was something in his eyes now, something distant. "What's happening to you?" she demanded. Alex didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing the bark of the tree again. This time, there was no searing pain, but something far worse, a rush of coldness, a sensation of emptiness that seemed to seep into his very soul. It was as if the tree was absorbing something from him, drawing out his energy, his essence. He could feel his body growing weaker with every passing second, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He staggered back, his breath shallow. "It's not letting go." His voice was hoarse, strained. "It wants us to stay, to become part of it." Mia's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that might offer an escape. But all she saw were the otherworldly symbols that continued to pulse on the walls, growing brighter and more erratic. They seemed to form shapes now, shifting like liquid in the corners of her vision. The room felt alive, breathing with a terrible, rhythmic pulse that matched the pounding in her chest. Jason pulled her away from the tree, his grip tightening on her wrist. "Alex, snap out of it," he shouted, but there was no response. Alex was already too far gone, his eyes glazed over, his expression vacant. Mia felt a surge of fear and frustration. This wasn't their friend anymore. The Alex they knew was slipping away, replaced by something darker, something other. "Please, come on, Alex," Mia cried. "We need to leave. This place is wrong." The ground beneath their feet trembled. The tree began to groan, its roots shifting beneath the stone floor, as if awakening from some long slumber. Then, as if in response to Mia's words, the symbols on the walls flared up, a burst of brilliant light flooding the room. Mia shielded her eyes from the blinding glow, and when she looked again, something had changed. The figures hanging from the tree were no longer lifeless. Their eyes were wide open, their faces contorted in agony, but they moved now, slowly, shakily, as though they were waking from a long, unnatural sleep. Their mouths opened in unison, and a single, unified cry tore through the room. A scream so haunting it felt as though it had come from the depths of the earth itself. Alex dropped to his knees, clutching his head as though the sound was physically tearing him apart. His screams joined theirs, but his voice was distorted, unrecognizable. "It's too late," he gasped between ragged breaths. "We're all already part of it." Mia and Jason rushed to him, their panic escalating with each passing second. But no matter how much they tried to pull him back, it was as if an invisible force held him in place. The figures continued to sway from the tree, their bodies twitching unnaturally, and with each movement, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. Mia turned to Jason, her eyes wide with terror. We're stuck here, aren't we? We can't get out. Not without." Her words trailed off, a terrifying realization settling over her. There was no escape, not unless they paid the price. Jason's face twisted in horror. "There's got to be another way," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be a way to stop it." But even as the words left his mouth, the truth began to settle in. The tree was not just a part of this place. It was the very source of everything. The ship, the darkness, the whispers, all of it had been leading them here. And now, there was no way out without making a sacrifice. Mia stepped back, her eyes glued to Alex's form, as he slowly began to rise again. His eyes were no longer vacant, but filled with a terrible, knowing light. It was as if he had crossed over into another realm, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. The tree had claimed him. "Run," he whispered hoarsely, his voice no longer his own. "Before it's too late." But there was nowhere to run, no escape from the path that they had already walked. The moment they stepped onto the ship, they had sealed their fate. The offering had already been made, and in the end, they would be nothing more than part of the twisted, living web of the heart of the void. The moment Alex spoke, Mia and Jason froze. The words he had uttered were not his own. They were cold, detached, like a command from something much greater than them. The room's atmosphere had thickened, as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing down on them, suffocating them. Alex was no longer their friend. The man who had laughed and shared stories with them just hours ago was gone. What remained was something far darker, a vessel for something ancient and malevolent. Jason glanced at Mia, his face a mirror of disbelief. "What did he mean?" he whispered. His voice was tight, almost too afraid to break the suffocating silence that surrounded them. "Before it's too late? What does that even mean?" Mia could barely answer. She was staring at Alex, his body trembling as though it was being pulled apart by invisible strings. His eyes, once filled with warmth and humor, now gleamed with a strange intensity, a light that was not entirely human. His skin looked too pale, his breath shallow. Something inside him had shifted, like a switch had been flipped, leaving only a hollow shell behind. The symbols on the walls of the room pulsed once more, their shapes becoming more complex, more intricate. Mia could feel them vibrating in her chest, a rhythm that seemed to sync with her heartbeat, amplifying her dread. The air around them crackled with a terrible, almost tangible energy, and she could no longer deny the truth that had been lingering in the back of her mind since they first stepped aboard the ship. They were trapped. There was no escape from this place. Jason turned to Mia, his grip on her arm tightening. "We need to find a way out. There has to be something we can do." But as he spoke, a new voice, cold, haunting, echoed through the room, seeming to come from every corner at once. "You think you can escape? There is no running. The pact has already been sealed." Mia's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, but distant, like an ancient whisper that had reverberated through the corridors of time. It was the same voice they had heard before, the voice from the tree. It was speaking directly to them, to their very souls. There was no hiding from it, no avoiding the truth. The room seemed to shift again. The walls rippled like water, the very air warping around them, bending reality to the will of whatever force controlled this place. Mia's mind raced. The offering, the pact. She had heard stories of such things, rituals in which lives were traded for power, for salvation, or worse. But she had never believed it, never imagined she would be standing in the middle of one. And now, here she was caught in the grip of something so much larger than her understanding. Jason let go of Mia's arm and took a step forward, his fists clenched in anger and fear. "What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice echoing, challenging the unseen force. "We didn't make any pact." The air seemed to thicken with the weight of the words. The temperature dropped, and Mia shivered. But then, in the oppressive silence that followed, the voice spoke again, its tone calm, almost mocking. "You didn't make a pact. You never needed to. You've been chosen. The ship has chosen you." Jason recoiled, stumbling back. "Chosen? What the hell does that mean?" The voice didn't answer, but the symbols on the walls grew brighter, more intense, as though answering his question with a horrific truth. Mia felt her stomach lurch. She didn't want to know the answer, but she couldn't stop herself from understanding. The ship, this cursed, decaying ship, was alive. It had been waiting, lurking beneath the surface of the ocean, for the right people, the right souls to board it. And now they had arrived. They had crossed the threshold into a world where the rules of time and space no longer applied, where ancient forces reigned supreme. They were no longer guests, they were prey, and the ship had chosen them. Mia's heart pounded in her chest. No, this can't be real," she whispered. "This can't be happening." But Alex's eyes turned to her, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something human beneath the surface. "You're right," he whispered hoarsely, his voice raspy, as though it hurt to speak. "It's not real, but it is." His lips trembled as he tried to focus, his hands shaking violently. Jason moved toward him, his voice urgent. "Alex, what are you trying to say?" But Alex couldn't answer. His body convulsed, and his eyes rolled back in his head. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. The room seemed to warp once more, the floor beneath their feet buckling, distorting as though they were being pulled deeper into the ship's very bones. Mia's legs buckled beneath her as the force of the ship's pull seemed to tighten, drawing them further into its grasp. And then, in a chilling instant, the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness. The temperature dropped to freezing, and Mia's breath came out in foggy bursts. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the pounding of her own heart. The air was thick with the sense of something lurking, something waiting. Suddenly, Alex's voice returned, but it was not the voice they knew. It was distorted, deepened, filled with an unearthly resonance that echoed through the room. "You have made your choice," it said. "The bargain is struck." The words sank into the depths of Mia's mind, and she understood, too late. This was not a nightmare. This was the beginning of something far worse, something that they could not outrun, something that was now tied to their very souls. There was no turning back from what they had awakened. The ship had claimed them, and there was no way to undo the bargain. The next few moments passed in a blur for Mia, Jason, and Alex. Time seemed to warp, stretching out until they felt as though they had been suspended in the same terrifying moment for hours. The air, once thick with the oppressive weight of dread, had shifted. It was colder now, more suffocating, and yet there was an eerie silence that surrounded them, as though the ship itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Mia's hands trembled as she clutched the railing that had materialized in front of her. Her mind was racing, but the thoughts did not come together. She wanted to scream, to run, but the reality of their situation was sinking in far too quickly. They were trapped. Alex, their friend, was not himself anymore. He was someone or something else. And the ship was not just a vessel. It was alive. Jason's voice broke through the fog of fear, but it felt distant, hollow. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay on this ship, Mia. We have to do something." His eyes were wild with panic, and Mia could see the sweat dripping from his forehead despite the freezing cold. She wanted to agree, to find a way out, but the reality was dawning on her. Escaping was not an option. Not anymore. There were no windows, no doors. The walls, the floor, everything felt as though it was closing in on them, sealing them inside a cage they could not break. Mia felt a wave of nausea rise in her chest. What had they done? What had they awakened? She reached for Alex, hoping for a sign, hoping that the man she had known was still somewhere inside. But his body convulsed again, his hands reaching for the air as though grasping at something only he could see. Suddenly, Alex's voice returned, but it was no longer a whisper. It was louder, more forceful. "The bargain has been sealed," he said, his tone a strange mixture of resignation and command. "The ship does not let go. It takes what it wants. You will understand soon." His eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto Mia with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Mia wanted to scream at him, to ask him what he meant, but she couldn't find her voice. Her throat was dry, constricted. There was something in the way Alex spoke now, something hollow and distant, that made her realize he wasn't entirely there. Whatever had taken hold of him had made him a vessel, a puppet, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened to him next, it would happen to them as well. Jason, sensing Mia's fear, turned away and began pacing, muttering to himself. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." But deep down, Mia knew it was. She could feel the pulse of the ship beneath her feet, the faint hum of its engines, the way it seemed to breathe with them. It was alive in a way she couldn't fully comprehend, but it was undeniable. As if on cue, the ship lurched forward with a sudden, violent shake, throwing them all off balance. Mia stumbled, nearly falling, but Jason grabbed her arm to steady her. The lights flickered once more, and for a moment, everything went dark again. The darkness was thick, like a blanket that smothered everything around them. Then, just as suddenly, the lights returned, but the ship had changed. The air felt heavier, denser. They were no longer in the room where it all began. The space they now occupied was unfamiliar, vast and empty. It looked like a ballroom, polished floors that stretched endlessly in every direction, high ceilings with intricate chandeliers that swayed gently as if moved by an invisible hand. The walls, however, were not made of glass or stone, but of shifting shadows, undulating and breathing like the ship itself. Mia blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice breaking through the eerie silence. Jason didn't answer at first. Instead, he took a cautious step forward, glancing around. "This doesn't feel right. This whole ship, it's not real. It's not natural." Mia nodded, her heart pounding. "It's like we've been transported somewhere else. Like we're trapped in a different world." And that was when they heard it, the faintest sound at first like a whisper carried by the wind. But it grew louder, and it became clear that it wasn't the wind. It was something else. A voice. A chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, but none of them making sense. Mia's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. The voices weren't speaking to each other. They were speaking to them. To her. The bargain is eternal. The debt is paid. Mia's body froze as the words echoed around her, surrounding her, reverberating through her bones. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as the truth became undeniable. This wasn't just a ship. It was a place beyond time, beyond reason. A place that didn't care about the rules of the world they had known. A place where the bargain had been made long before they had ever set foot on it. Jason's face turned pale. He turned to Mia, his eyes wide with terror. "Mia, we've made a mistake. We're not just on a ship. We're inside something." Before she could respond, the floor beneath them trembled again, a deep, resonating thrum that felt like the ship itself was stretching, shifting. In the distance, Mia saw something, shapes emerging from the shadows, moving toward them. Figures, distorted, their outlines flickering in and out of existence. Her breath caught in her throat. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, but it was already too late. The ship had claimed them, and they were no longer just passengers. They were part of the ship's dark story now, bound by a pact they couldn't break. And as the shapes grew closer, Mia realized with growing horror that there was no escaping the ship. Not now. Not ever. The ship seemed to breathe around them as they stood there in the dimly lit ballroom, frozen by the realization that escape was no longer an option. Mia's mind was a storm of confusion and fear, but amidst the chaos of her thoughts, one terrifying question stood out. What was the bargain that had been sealed? Alex's cryptic words haunted her, reverberating through her every nerve. The bargain is eternal. The debt is paid. What did it mean for them? What price had they unknowingly agreed to pay? Jason, visibly shaken, kept his eyes locked on the shifting shadows that now filled the room. The distorted figures that had been drifting toward them were closer now, their forms no longer flickering but solidifying, taking shape. They were humanoid, but their movements were unnatural, jerky, and fluid all at once. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were smooth and featureless, yet the sense of malice and intent was undeniable. Mia took a step back, her legs unsteady. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of the air around her was pressing down, suffocating her. The figures had stopped moving now, standing at the edges of the ballroom as if they were waiting for something, watching. Their presence was overwhelming, their silence deafening. Mia wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt paralyzed, as if the ship itself was holding her in place. Jason, ever the skeptic, swallowed hard and looked toward Alex. He was still standing motionless, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body jerking occasionally as though it were being controlled by some unseen force. "What did you do to him?" Jason demanded, his voice sharp with desperation. "What happened to our friend?" Alex didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon of the ballroom. But it wasn't Alex's voice that spoke next. It was the voice of the ship, a low, rumbling sound that reverberated through the floorboards, like a growl from the depths of the sea. "The price has been paid," the voice intoned, each word dripping with an ancient authority that sent a shiver crawling up Mia's spine. "The debt is settled. Your souls are mine now, for eternity." Mia gasped, her blood running cold. Souls? The ship, this thing, had claimed them. She felt her knees weaken as the gravity of the situation pressed down upon her. There was no turning back. They were part of it now, woven into its dark fabric. No longer passengers, no longer human. Mia could almost hear the faint thrum of the ship's heartbeat, a rhythm that echoed in her skull, telling her that everything had changed. Jason's voice trembled as he clutched at Mia's arm. "No, this can't be happening. This is just some twisted game. We can still get out, we just need to..." But before he could finish, the shadows around them shifted. The humanoid figures began to move again, advancing slowly toward the group. They didn't make a sound, but each step felt like the crushing weight of inevitability. They had no eyes, but Mia could feel their gaze, the weight of it pressing against her. Without warning, the figures reached Alex. He didn't resist. He didn't move. In a fluid motion, the shadowed beings extended their arms and enveloped him, drawing him into their folds. His body spasmed, and for a fleeting moment, Mia saw the briefest flash of recognition in his eyes. Then, just as quickly, he was swallowed whole by the shadows. The air around them shifted, and the light seemed to dim, as if the room itself had lost its vibrancy. Mia screamed, reaching out in vain, but it was too late. Alex was gone. For a long, agonizing moment, Mia could only stand there, her heart pounding in her chest, too stunned to speak. Her thoughts raced. She wanted to run, but where could they go? Every corner of the ship now felt like an abyss, its very walls closing in on them, twisting reality. Jason's grip on her arm tightened, pulling her back to reality. "They're taking us one by one," Jason said, his voice low and broken. He didn't even seem to realize what he was saying. "They're taking us, Mia. One by one." The chilling reality of his words settled into Mia's bones. Whatever this was, whatever they were, it wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't a ship that had been cursed. No, this was a vessel, a living, breathing entity that fed on the souls of those who boarded it. They weren't guests on this ship. They were prey, and they had been marked from the moment they stepped aboard. The figures had paused, their attention now focused on the two of them. Mia could feel the oppressive pressure of their gaze, like an invisible force pushing down on her. They moved closer now, slowly and deliberately, as if they were savoring the moment. Each step they took seemed to echo in Mia's mind, reverberating through the ship's hull, louder than the last. Mia turned to Jason, her voice trembling as she spoke. "What do we do now?" she whispered. "How do we stop this?" Jason's face was pale, his lips trembling, but there was a fire in his eyes, a spark of defiance, despite the overwhelming fear. "We fight," he said, his voice steadying. "We have to fight. We can't just give up." But as the figures closed in, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in control of their own fate. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for their very souls. And in this place, the ship was the only master. And it always took what it was owed. The silence that followed the disappearance of Alex was suffocating. Mia and Jason stood frozen, their breath shallow, their hearts racing. The figures around them remained motionless, like sentinels guarding an eternal secret. The room was unervingly still, the air thick with the weight of the ship's dark influence. The calm before the storm was more terrifying than anything they had faced so far. It was as if the very essence of the ship was waiting for them to make a move, to seal their fate with whatever decision they made next. Jason broke the silence first, his voice low and strained. "We need to do something. This can't be happening. Alex is gone. He's gone, and it's our fault. We made that damn deal." Mia shook her head, her thoughts spinning. She could feel the ship, its presence pressing down on her, making it harder to think clearly. The events of the past hours had blurred into a nightmare, but Jason's words struck her with an undeniable clarity. They had made a deal, but it wasn't just any deal. It was one forged in blood and shadow. The bargain is eternal. The debt is paid. The words from earlier echoed in her mind, rattling around like a curse. What had they truly agreed to? What price had they unknowingly pledged to pay? In that moment, Mia understood that they were not merely victims of the ship's malevolent power. They were complicit. They had become part of something much larger, something ancient, that existed far beyond their understanding. Mia felt her knees weaken, and she staggered toward one of the nearby pillars, leaning against it for support. The weight of guilt, of helplessness, threatened to crush her. She wanted to scream, to break down, but she couldn't. That would be too easy. She had to focus. They both did. Alex was gone, but they were still alive for now. That in itself was a blessing, but it was also a curse. Jason was pacing now, muttering to himself. This is a nightmare. We just have to get off the ship. That's all we need to do. Just get off. And he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes wide with realization. No, it's not that simple. It's never that simple. The truth settled over them like a cold shroud. The ship wasn't just a prison. It was an entity, a being that fed on the souls of those who dared to cross its threshold. And as much as they wanted to believe they could escape, the truth was clearer than ever. The ship wouldn't let them leave. Not unless they paid their dues. Mia's thoughts flashed to the events of the night before the hangovers and the panic had set in. The strange music, the flickering lights, the unsettling whispers that had drifted through the halls. They had dismissed it all as part of the festivities, the excesses of New Year's Eve. But now, in the wake of Alex's disappearance, she saw it for what it truly was. It was a prelude, a warning. The ship had been playing with them long before they realized it. We have to break the deal, Mia whispered, almost to herself. The idea had been forming in the back of her mind for some time now, but it had taken the disappearance of Alex to bring it into focus. If the bargain was eternal, if the debt was paid, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to undo it. Jason stopped pacing and turned to face her. Break the deal? How? We don't even know what it is we agreed to, Mia. How are we supposed to break something we don't understand? Mia didn't have an answer. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little they truly knew about the forces they were dealing with. But that didn't matter. What mattered now was that they had to try. They couldn't just accept this fate, couldn't simply wait for the next shadowed figure to take them. They had to do something. The sound of footsteps interrupted their thoughts. Mia turned toward the sound, heart pounding in her chest. The figures were moving again, slowly, deliberately. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were coming for them. Jason grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. Run, he yelled, panic flooding his voice. But Mia didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, her body unwilling to obey. The shadows were closer now, their presence suffocating. She could feel their cold, empty gaze fixed on her, and she realized with a sickening certainty that running was no longer an option. They weren't just being hunted by the ship's shadowy inhabitants. They were being watched. The shadows stopped just a few feet away from them. There was no sound, no movement, but the oppressive feeling of being trapped, of being caught in a web with no escape, was unbearable. Mia's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing for a way out. And then, in the midst of the stillness, a voice spoke. The oath is broken. The voice was low and guttural, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It felt as if the very walls of the ship were speaking to them, as if the ship itself were alive, aware of their every thought. Mia's heart skipped a beat. The oath? What oath? You have broken your pact, the voice continued, now sharper, more menacing. The debt is yours to settle, and you will pay. Jason's face went pale. What do you want from us? He shouted. We didn't mean for this to happen. But the voice cut him off, its tone cold and final. You wanted to be part of the feast. Now you will join it. Mia felt the world around her tilt, her legs giving way as she collapsed to the floor. The shadows moved toward them again, this time with undeniable purpose. The ship's hold on them was tightening, its grip unyielding. Mia could feel the weight of the bargain pressing down on her like an anchor. Whatever they had done, whatever Alex had done, they were now bound to this cursed vessel forever. And there was no escaping the price of immortality. The shadows moved closer, their forms twisting and contorting like liquid smoke. Mia and Jason were both paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to run. The ship seemed to hum with an eerie energy, its very essence vibrating with a malevolent force. Mia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. The voice had been clear. The bargain had been broken, and they were now bound to the ship in a way they couldn't fully understand. The coldness in the air deepened, chilling them to the bone. The oppressive feeling was no longer just in their minds. It had become a physical presence, pressing down on them, suffocating them with every passing second. They could feel it in their skin, the sharp sting of an unseen force that made them ache in ways they couldn't explain. Mia tried to stand, but her legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. She looked to Jason, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. The figures that surrounded them remained still, watching, waiting. They made no sound, their movements barely perceptible. It was as though they were observing a moment in time, a pause before the inevitable. The oppressive silence was deafening, amplifying the chaos in Mia's mind. What had Alex meant when he disappeared? Had he broken the pact? Or had he been taken before he could fulfill it? Could they undo what had been done? Or were they already too far gone? Jason was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling as he whispered, "What now? What do we do? We have to find a way out of here. We can't just sit here and wait to die." His words hung in the air, charged with desperation. He was grasping at anything, trying to find a lifeline in the dark sea of uncertainty. Mia wanted to respond, wanted to give him something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The ship wasn't just a physical space. It was a manifestation of something ancient, something beyond their understanding. They had made a deal, a pact, and now they had broken it. The consequences were clear, but the path to salvation was not. The voice from before spoke again, its tone carrying the same cold finality. "You cannot escape what is owed. The debt will be paid. The ship will claim what it is due." Mia's heart clenched in her chest. The debt. What did that mean? What price had they unknowingly agreed to? Had they sealed their fates when they first stepped aboard, or was it the reckless decision to accept the ship's strange offer on New Year's Eve that had doomed them? Her mind flashed back to the night before, to the wild celebration that had begun with such promise. They had been carefree, intoxicated by the excitement of the new year, unaware that the ship had been slowly, methodically pulling them into its web. The strange occurrences, the odd sensations that had felt like nothing more than the effects of too much alcohol, were now undeniably tied to something darker. They had all been pawns in a game they never understood, and the consequences of their choices were now unraveling before them. Jason grabbed her arm, pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. "Mia, we need to think. There has to be something we can do. We need to find the captain, or..." His voice faltered as a shadow moved closer, its figure growing more solid, more defined. It loomed above them like a towering specter, its presence suffocating. The ship seemed to warp around them, as if reality itself was bending in response to the entity's approach. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. It was not like the others, it was different. Taller, more corporeal. Its face was obscured by a mask-like distortion, a hollow, empty void where features should have been. The figure's voice was deep and echoing, as if it came from the very bowels of the ship itself. "You have been chosen. You were meant for this. The pact cannot be undone, for it is written in blood. The ship is eternal, and so are you." Mia's breath caught in her throat as the words settled into her mind. The ship was eternal? They were meant for this? What did that mean? Was she hearing things? Was this all part of some twisted nightmare? She had no answer, but the chilling finality in the figure's voice made it clear. There was no turning back. Jason's grip on her arm tightened, and for a moment, Mia thought she could feel his pulse racing, beating in time with her own. "We have to stop this," he muttered. "We have to fight back." His words were full of conviction, but there was an underlying panic in his voice. He knew as well as she did that there was no easy way out of this. Mia closed her eyes for a moment, taking in a shaky breath. She had no idea how they could fight something like this. How could they possibly fight an ancient entity, a ship that seemed to be alive, that had already taken one of their own? But as the figure loomed closer, as its hollow gaze seemed to pierce through her very soul, Mia understood that they didn't have a choice. They had to fight, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The ship's presence grew stronger, more oppressive. The walls seemed to pulse, the very air thickening with tension. Mia could feel it now, the weight of the ship's power pressing against her, suffocating her with every passing second. It wasn't just the ship, it was alive. It was aware. It was a force of nature, as old as the sea itself, and it had a hunger that could never be satisfied. Jason looked at her with wild eyes. Mia, what are we going to do? She didn't have the answer. But in that moment, as the shadows closed in and the ship's dark grip tightened, Mia made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would fight to the end. She would not be consumed by this darkness. She would find a way to break the cycle, to sever the bond between herself and the ship. Because if she didn't, the price of immortality would be the last thing she ever knew. The ship's hum grew louder as the air around Mia and Jason seemed to vibrate with the weight of its power. The overwhelming presence of the entity, this ancient force that had claimed them, was undeniable. Every inch of the vessel felt like it was pulsing with dark energy, as if it were alive, feeding on their fear. It was a constant reminder that they were trapped with no clear way out. Mia's thoughts raced as she tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The ship was eternal. She was now bound to it, along with Jason, forever. The idea of immortality seemed alluring in the abstract, but in this context, it was nothing more than a curse. To live forever on this forsaken vessel, forever at the mercy of whatever ancient forces controlled it, was the last fate she would have chosen. And yet, it had been thrust upon her. Jason, ever the pragmatist, seemed to be struggling with the same realization. He was pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath, trying to come up with a plan, anything that could give them a glimmer of hope. "We can't just give up," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "There has to be something we can do. We need to fight this." Mia didn't know if fighting was the answer. What was there to fight against? A ship? A being? Something that existed beyond time and reason? She wasn't sure. But the overwhelming sense of power and control emanating from the ship seemed to suggest that any attempt at resistance would be futile. The ship didn't just want to claim them. It had already begun to reshape their very existence. The thought that they might be stuck here for eternity was unbearable. What kind of life could they live if they were to stay trapped on this haunted ship forever? The people they had once been would be lost in the passage of time, reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. And yet, they were still here, still alive, with only the faintest echo of the life they had known. The thought of Alex, lost to whatever force had taken him, lingered in the back of her mind. He had been the first to disappear. Had he known something they hadn't? Had he been claimed before he could fulfill whatever twisted promise the ship demanded? His absence only served to reinforce the feeling of isolation that was creeping over Mia and Jason. They were alone now. The others had already been consumed by the ship's will, or perhaps they had vanished as Alex had, swallowed by the darkness that now seemed to hang over the entire vessel. And then there was the figure, the one who had spoken to them with that chilling, echoing voice, the one that had explained the terms of their fate. Its words still echoed in Mia's mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The debt will be paid. The ship will claim what it is due. What did that mean? What was the price they were meant to pay? It was as if they had unknowingly signed a contract with the ship, and now it was time to collect. The more Mia thought about it, the more she realized the ship had been pulling them into its orbit from the very beginning. It hadn't just been their poor decision to board the vessel. It had been the ship itself, manipulating them, ensuring they would end up in this exact situation. It was no accident that they had celebrated the turn of the year on a ship that had been drifting through the ocean for untold years, untouched by time. It was no accident that they had made the choices they did, stepping into a world that had long been sealed away from reality. As the minutes passed, the weight of their predicament pressed down even harder. Mia felt as though she was suffocating, the air too thick to breathe. She could barely think, could barely hold on to the fleeting memories of the life she had left behind. Every thought was drowned out by the relentless thrum of the ship's power and the feeling that she was no longer fully herself, that she had been swallowed by something much larger than her. Jason's voice broke through her reverie. "Mia, look." He pointed toward the far side of the ship, where the shadows seemed to move in a way that was unnatural. The figures that had haunted them earlier were back, but this time they were different. They were shifting as if they were not quite solid, their movements too fluid, too fast to be real. They flickered in and out of existence like ghosts caught between dimensions. Mia stared at them, unable to look away. The figures seemed to call to her, drawing her in, their form shifting into something more familiar, something from her past. At first, she thought it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the pressure of their situation. But the longer she looked, the more real they became. The figures took on the shapes of people she knew, faces she hadn't seen in years. They were her family, her friends, her old life. They were standing before her, smiling as if nothing had changed. As if the years, the mistakes, and the horrors of the past were all but a distant memory. Her heart skipped a beat. Were they real? Or were they another illusion created by the ship? "Don't fall for it," Jason warned, his voice shaking. "It's trying to trick you." Mia's head spun. It was as if the ship was dredging up memories, throwing them in her face, daring her to believe them. The ship had the power to manipulate the past, to bring those lost to it back in some twisted form. They weren't real, but the emotions they stirred were. The joy, the warmth, the love she had once known. It all came rushing back, threatening to break her down. Mia closed her eyes, forcing herself to look away. The past was gone. The people she had known were gone. The ship had taken them, and there was no going back. But the desire to believe in the illusion was strong, pulling at her heart. It would be so easy to give in, to believe that she could reclaim what she had lost. But deep down, Mia knew better. She couldn't escape the reality of their situation. They were trapped. The ship was not going to let them go. No matter how much they longed for the past, they could not outrun what they had become, a part of the ship, a part of its eternal journey. Jason's voice cut through her thoughts again. "Mia, we need to get to the captain. We need to end this." The desperation in his tone broke through the fog that had clouded her mind. There was no other choice. They had to find a way to confront the source of this nightmare, to break the hold the ship had on them. Whatever price had been paid, whatever debt had been incurred, it wasn't enough. They couldn't remain trapped in the past forever. They had to move forward, even if it meant confronting the very thing that held them prisoner. Mia nodded, her resolve hardening. Together, they would face whatever horrors lay ahead. But the echoes of the past would not be easily silenced. Mia's mind felt like it was unraveling as she and Jason made their way through the winding halls of the ship. The once vibrant atmosphere had been replaced by an oppressive silence, the only sound being the rhythmic hum of the engine deep beneath them. The echoes of the past still lingered in the corners of her thoughts, pulling her back to that fleeting moment when she had seen the faces of her family, her lost connections, reaching out to her. It was as if the ship had become a mirror, reflecting her deepest desires and fears, distorting them into something unrecognizable. Jason, ever the pragmatist, pushed forward, his pace quickening as they navigated the corridors. His eyes darted nervously, constantly scanning their surroundings, as though he expected something to jump out at them from the shadows. He had been right to warn her against falling for the illusions, but the temptation was so powerful. How could she resist? The ship was designed to prey on that vulnerability, to warp their emotions until they were nothing more than puppets in its grand scheme. Every step they took seemed to take them deeper into the heart of the ship, into the very belly of this cursed vessel. The walls, once gleaming and elegant, were now coated with a layer of grime, as though the ship itself had been decaying for centuries. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the atmosphere was growing colder by the second. It was as though the ship was aware of their presence, aware that they were trying to escape the grasp it had on them. Jason's voice broke the silence, sharp and urgent. "We need to find a captain. This isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about understanding what the hell is going on. Why are we still here? Why are we trapped? Mia nodded absently, but inside, her thoughts were racing. The captain. They needed answers, yes, but there was a growing sense within her that they were searching for something that may not exist. What if the captain was just another illusion? Another part of the ship's game? What if there was no way out at all? No real escape from the eternal cycle the ship had entangled them in. As they ventured further, a low, unsettling sound began to reverberate through the ship. A distant, mournful wail, like a ship's horn but distorted and unnaturally drawn out. It wasn't the sound of a normal ship, and it chilled Mia to her core. The wail seemed to resonate with the ship's power, vibrating through the metal walls as though it were an extension of the ship itself. She looked to Jason, but he didn't seem to react. Had he already grown numb to it? Or was he pretending to be unaffected? It didn't matter, Mia realized. The ship was not just a vessel. It was alive. It was an ancient entity that existed beyond the physical realm. A malevolent force that had captured their souls and twisted their perception of reality. They were not passengers. They were prisoners, bound by something far older than their understanding of time and space. Their journey took them into a part of the ship they had not yet seen, an area that appeared abandoned, with rusted metal walls and broken light fixtures. The dim lights that flickered overhead seemed to struggle to stay on, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Mia's heart began to race as she took in the desolate scene before her. It looked like a place that had been untouched for decades, perhaps even longer. And yet, there was something undeniably wrong about it. The stillness was too perfect, the silence too absolute. Suddenly, they reached a large door at the end of the corridor, its surface battered and worn, as though it had been opened and closed 1,000 times over. The door had a strange, ominous feel to it, and Mia hesitated before stepping forward. But Jason, determined as ever, pushed it open with a forceful shove. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a vast chamber inside. What they found within the room was beyond their worst nightmares. The walls were covered in strange markings, runes, symbols, and carvings that Mia could not begin to decipher. In the center of the room, suspended in midair, was a large, glowing crystal, pulsating with an eerie, unnatural light. The room felt alive with energy, charged with a dark force that seemed to reach out and envelop them the moment they stepped inside. Jason took a cautious step forward, his eyes fixed on the crystal. "This is it," he whispered, a strange reverence in his voice. "This is what's been keeping us here. This is what's controlling everything." Mia could feel the pull of the crystal, its power drawing her in. It was as if it were calling to her, promising answers, offering her the key to escape. But she also felt a warning deep within her, a gut instinct that told her to stay away. The crystal was not their salvation. It was a trap, and approaching it could only lead to disaster. "Jason, don't," Mia said, her voice trembling with fear. "It's not what you think. It's the heart of the ship, the source of its power." But Jason was already too close, his hand reaching out to touch the crystal. The moment his fingers brushed against its surface, the room seemed to shake, and the crystal flared with an intense, blinding light. Mia staggered back, shielding her eyes as a deafening sound filled the air, a sound that seemed to be coming from all directions, as if the very ship itself were screaming in agony. Jason screamed, his voice high and desperate, but it was drowned out by the roar of the ship. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him struggle, his body writhing as if something unseen were pulling at him, dragging him toward the crystal. It was as if the ship was rejecting him, punishing him for daring to touch its heart. In that moment, Mia realized the terrifying truth. The ship was not just alive, it was sentient. It was aware of them, of their every move, and it had been manipulating them all along. They were not the first to fall prey to its power. Others had been here before, and they had all succumbed to the ship's will. Jason was now just another casualty, another soul caught in the ship's web. As the crystal's light intensified, Mia felt her mind begin to fragment, her thoughts slipping away as the ship's presence overwhelmed her. The wail grew louder, and the darkness began to close in around her, swallowing the room whole. She could hear Jason's cries echoing in the distance, but they were becoming faint, lost in the abyss that was pulling her under. And then, just as the darkness consumed her, she heard a voice, a whisper, soft and cold, in her ear. "It is time." And with that, everything went black. Mia awoke with a sudden jolt, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as though she had just risen from the depths of a nightmare. Her surroundings were unrecognizable. The room she found herself in was dimly lit, the walls cold and bare, with only a single flickering light above her head. She felt disoriented, her mind still struggling to piece together what had happened. The last thing she remembered was the blinding light of the crystal and Jason's desperate cries. Where was he now? And where was she? As her senses began to sharpen, she realized that the overwhelming sense of dread that had permeated the ship was still there. But now it felt different. It was as if the atmosphere had shifted, like the ship had drawn a deep, exhausted breath and was now holding it, waiting. Mia's eyes darted around the room, searching for some sign, some explanation for her inexplicable situation. The room was sterile, almost hospital-like in its darkness, but it felt more like a prison than anything else. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, as though she had been asleep for far too long. Her hand brushed against the cold metal wall, and she flinched. The chill it sent through her body felt unnatural, as though the very air was infused with something wrong, something alien. She took a few tentative steps forward, her heart pounding with an unsettling mix of anxiety and curiosity. What had happened to the ship? What had happened to Jason? The door at the far end of the room creaked open, and Mia's body tensed, her muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. She watched as a shadow stepped into the doorway, its silhouette long and distorted in the dim light. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm, telling herself that it could be anyone, someone who could help her, someone who knew what was going on. But as the figure stepped fully into view, Mia's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a person at all. It was a thing, twisted, malformed, and undeniably human in its form, but altered beyond recognition. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes sunken and lifeless. The thing's mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, but no sound came from it. It simply stood there, its gaze fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. Mia took a step back, but the creature didn't move. It simply watched her, its eyes cold and hollow, as if it were studying her every reaction. The ship had done something to them. This was no longer just a ship. It had become a dark, malevolent force, a parasite that fed on the lives it trapped within its walls. With a sudden, shuddering realization, Mia understood. The ship wasn't just controlling them. It had been feeding on their memories, their fears, their very souls. The crystal, the wailing, the illusions, they were all part of the ship's feeding process. And now, she had become part of its cycle. Jason had been pulled into it, just as she had been, and now whatever that thing was, it was the ship's way of keeping her there. But Mia refused to let herself be consumed by it. She had already seen too much, felt too much of the ship's insidious power. If she didn't escape now, she would never escape at all. Before she could think further, the creature took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Its movements were unnaturally smooth, as though it were gliding across the floor rather than walking. Mia's heart raced as the creature's hand reached out toward her. It felt as though time had slowed, every second stretching into infinity as she stared at the outstretched hand. She could feel the air around her crackling with an unnatural energy, as though something were about to happen. Just as the creature's hand was inches from her, Mia made a split-second decision. She bolted, racing toward the door, her breath ragged and desperate. She didn't know where she was running to, or what she would find on the other side, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stay here. Not with that thing, not with whatever the ship had become. Her hands fumbled for the door handle, her fingers slick with sweat, and she yanked it open, stepping into the corridor beyond. She stumbled into the hallway, disoriented but determined to find a way out. The ship's labyrinthine halls stretched endlessly before her, the walls now warped and twisted in ways that made no sense, as if reality itself had begun to bend under the weight of the ship's malevolent force. Mia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of her situation. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were trapped inside its body. There was no escape, no way out. But then, a thought struck her like a lightning bolt. She wasn't alone. Jason had to be somewhere on this ship. He had to be. She couldn't let herself believe he was gone. She wouldn't let herself. Mia's breath hitched in her throat as she pressed forward, her resolve hardening. She would find Jason. She would find the truth. And she would escape, no matter what it took. In the distance, she thought she saw a figure, a shadow moving just beyond the reach of the dim lights. Her heart leaped in her chest as she broke into a run. Was it him? Was it really Jason? But as she drew closer, the figure turned, and Mia's blood ran cold. It wasn't Jason. It was another one of them. Mia's heart raced as she stumbled backward, her breath coming in frantic gasps. The figure before her, twisted and ghastly, seemed to grow taller with each passing second, its pale eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. She had barely escaped one of them only moments ago, and now this new threat was standing in front of her, blocking her path. The once familiar hallways of the ship had become an impossible maze, its walls seeming to close in around her with every turn. She knew that the ship had been feeding on their fears, their memories, but now it felt like the very essence of the vessel had consumed the last remnants of hope. For a moment, Mia hesitated, her mind caught in a whirlwind of terror. She had been so focused on finding Jason, on discovering the truth, that she had failed to understand the full nature of the ship's power. It wasn't just a place of malice. It was a living, parasitic organism, an entity that thrived on the destruction of its inhabitants. Everything she had experienced had been its doing. The wailing, the twisted figures, the shifting reality. It was all part of its dark web, pulling them deeper into its grasp. But Mia couldn't afford to panic, not now. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to see Jason again, she had to find a way out. Her eyes darted around the corridor, looking for any means of escape. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The ship was toying with her, trying to break her resolve. But Mia had been through too much. She had seen too much. She wasn't about to let it win. The creature in front of her didn't move. It simply stood there, its eyes locked onto hers, as if waiting for her to make the next move. She knew that it wouldn't let her pass, that it was just another pawn in the ship's twisted game. But she had a plan. She had to move quickly and unpredictably. It had been Jason's idea when they were first exploring the ship's mysteries, and now it was her only hope. Mia clenched her fists and took a step forward, her gaze never leaving the creature. As she did, the thing's twisted grin stretched wider, and it took a step toward her. But Mia wasn't looking at the creature anymore. She was looking past it, at the faint glimmer of light at the far end of the hallway. She knew that beyond that light, there was a chance, just a chance, that she could escape. But she had to reach it first. With no warning, Mia dashed forward, her feet pounding the cold, metallic floor. The creature lunged after her, its monstrous form moving faster than she had anticipated. But she was ready. As the creature reached for her, Mia dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. She could feel the rush of air as its clawed hand skimmed her arm, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, faster, knowing that every second counted. The light at the end of the corridor seemed to grow brighter, closer, but the creature was relentless. It continued to chase her, its growls echoing through the ship like the sound of distant thunder. Mia's mind was consumed with the single thought of reaching the light. But the path was fraught with obstacles, with more twisted figures emerging from the shadows, each one seemingly more monstrous than the last. Finally, with one last burst of energy, Mia reached the light. It was coming from a door, an exit perhaps. She didn't think twice. She flung it open and stumbled into the room beyond. But what she found there was not what she expected. The room was empty, cold, silent, and bare. But in the center of the room stood a single object, the crystal. It was glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie rhythm that seemed to synchronize with Mia's heartbeat. She approached it cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for it. She had seen the crystal before. Jason had held it, just before everything had gone wrong. It was the key, the source of everything that had happened. The wailing, the twisted creatures, the endless chase. It had all been linked to this one object. But as Mia's fingers brushed against the crystal, something inside her snapped. The ship's power surged through her, filling her mind with visions of darkness and light. She saw the ship's true form, its monstrous, unholy shape, shifting and writhing like a creature from the deepest depths of the ocean. She saw Jason, trapped within it, his eyes wide with fear and despair. She saw the others, all of them, their faces twisted in agony as the ship fed on their memories. And then Mia saw the truth. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a trap, a prison built to capture souls, to feed on them for eternity. The crystal was its heart, its core, and it had been calling to her all along, drawing her in with its dark power. In that moment, Mia understood what she had to do. She wasn't just fighting to escape. She was fighting to destroy the ship, to break its hold on everyone it had ensnared. She knew that the crystal had to be destroyed, but doing so would come at a cost. The ship would retaliate, fighting with all its power to survive. But Mia was done running. She was done being afraid. With a final, resolute breath, Mia lifted the crystal high above her head. She felt its energy coursing through her, threatening to consume her, but she ignored it. This was her moment. This was her fight. And then, with all the strength she had left, Mia slammed the crystal onto the floor. The world seemed to explode in a blinding flash of light, and for a moment, Mia thought she might die, that the ship would take her with it. But as the light faded, Mia opened her eyes. The ship was silent. The wailing had stopped. The creatures were gone. The air was still, and the oppressive weight that had hung over her for so long had lifted. Mia stood in the center of the room, her heart still racing, but the terror that had once consumed her was gone. She was free. The ship, the nightmare, had been destroyed. And somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard Jason's voice calling her name. She wasn't alone after all.